The Star Trek franchise is going through the first transitional period of this current production era. The series that brought Star Trek back to television, or streaming technically, Star Trek Discovery, just completed its 5-season run. Another series, Star Trek Lower Decks, is set to finish up its 5-season run later this year. Last year, Star Trek Picard wrapped up after 3 seasons. Meanwhile, Star Trek Strange New Worlds is still going strong, with a 3rd season to be released sometime next year, and a 4th preparing to go into production. As of the making of this video, Star Trek Prodigy's 2nd season is about to drop on Netflix. A movie centered on Starfleet Black Ops Agency Section 31, starring Michelle Yeoh reprising her character from Discovery, is in production to be released eventually on streaming platform Paramount+, and a new series centered on Starfleet Academy in the 32nd century time period, first seen in the latter seasons of Discovery, is also in production. Oh, and there's also a new theatrical film on the way. Or so they say. We've heard that before. So, it's a moment of endings and new beginnings for the Star Trek franchise. As a fan, I think it's an exciting time. Lots of Star Trek in the pipeline, but that also makes me a little nervous. I love Strange New Worlds and Prodigy, and I'm looking forward to the new stuff from both of those shows, and while it had its flaws and I was particularly underwhelmed by its final season, I was overall a fan of Discovery, but not all of the current era of Star Trek has been what I would call good. These upcoming projects, the Section 31 movie, the Starfleet Academy series, I'm looking forward to them, but I'm also well aware that they might also turn out to be something other than good. Which, not the end of the world. There have been rotten Star Trek shows before. Seriously. But as a Trekkie and as someone who talks about Star Trek as a significant part of my job, it would be nice if the creators of these upcoming Star Trek projects, as well as the ones that will follow them, got it right. Fortunately, recent history has provided them and us with what I think is an excellent guide for how to make Star Trek that is modern, exciting, appealing to both longtime Trekkies and the general audience, true to the defining spirit of the franchise, and most importantly, good. And I'm going to tell you all about it in this video, which I am calling Why Star Trek Beyond should actually be the blueprint for new Trek. First, a brief summary of recent Star Trek history. 15 years ago, in May of 2009, Star Trek opened in movie theaters. Directed by J.J. Abrams, written by Roberto Orci and Alex Kurtzman, and starring a charismatic ensemble portraying younger versions of the original crew of the Starship Enterprise, led by Chris Pine as James Kirk, Zachary Quinto as Spock, Carl Urban as Dr. McCoy, and Zoe Saldana as Uhura. It was the first Star Trek film since 2002's Star Trek Nemesis, and the first canonical Star Trek production of any kind since the TV series Star Trek Enterprise ended 4 years earlier in 2005. The 7-year gap between films and the 4-year gap between the end of Enterprise and the premiere of the 2009 film represented the longest production hiatus for Star Trek since the 5 years that passed between the end of Star Trek the Animated Series in 1974 and the premiere of Star Trek the Motion Picture in 1979. The 2009 Star Trek film brought that hiatus to a triumphant end, becoming the highest-grossing Star Trek film ever at the U.S. domestic box office, a record it still holds. It also garnered mostly positive reviews and was generally received as an exciting and accessible reinterpretation of Star Trek. Its first sequel, Star Trek Into Darkness, also made a huge pile of money, but was less well-liked, especially by Trekkies, who were turned off by its derivative plot, which was a juiced-up, compressed retelling of both the classic Trek episodes Space Seed and Star Trek II The Wrath of Khan, with some War on Terror allegory and an evil admiral conspiracy mixed in for good measure. I still mostly like it, though I acknowledge that it doesn't get away with everything it tries, and even some of the stuff it does get away with probably shouldn't have been attempted to begin with. The third film in this rebooted Star Trek series is written by Simon Pegg and Doug Young and directed by Justin Lin. J.J. Abrams stepped back into a producer role for this one. Apparently he was busy directing a movie in another sci-fi action-adventure franchise. I don't know. Anyway, this movie came along in the summer of 2016, and even though its box office gross was less than the previous two, the prevailing opinion among both critics and hardcore fans was very positive. And for me, personally, the third time proved to be the charm. I really like the first two movies in the rebooted series, or the Kelvin timeline films as they're sort of officially known, but I love the third one. I count it among the very best of all Star Trek movies. Before I get into why, and why I think it should be the example the creators of new Star Trek projects follow, let me refresh your memory of what happens in Star Trek Beyond. We open on Captain Kirk addressing an assembly of Tenaxians. He's come on behalf of their longtime enemies, the Fibonans, and he's come with a gift, a piece of an ancient weapon, which the Fibonans would like the Tenaxians to have, as a gesture of peace. The Tenaxians, who it turns out are just Whittle, do not accept this gesture and attack Kirk. He gets beamed up to the Enterprise, along with a couple of Tenaxian hangers-on, and passes the ancient weapon to Spock, like, here, put this in a drawer somewhere. I'm sure we won't need to worry about it later. We get a captain's log from Kirk, where he informs us that the Enterprise is about 3 years into its 5-year mission, and things are going all right, but he's starting to feel like they're not really accomplishing anything. Maybe he's just depressed because his birthday is coming up and it'll make him 1 year older than his father lived to be. McCoy tries to make him feel better. They share a drink of some good booze McCoy stole from Chekhov, but it doesn't help. Kirk just seems over the whole Captain of the Enterprise thing. The ship puts in for resupply at Starbase Yorktown, a humongous artificial habitat at the edge of Federation space. I know I'm just getting started, but I need to pause the summary at this point so I can ask, how cool is Yorktown? It's maybe my favorite location in any of the Star Trek movies, original cast, TNG, or Kelvin timeline. It looks amazing. Dr. McCoy calls it a giant snow globe in space, and he means it as an insult, but I view it as a compliment. It has this mind-bending M.C. Escher quality with various levels of habitat wrapping around in different directions. It's huge, large enough for the Enterprise to just kind of glide in and park in a garage underneath one of the water features, and supports a population of several million people, apparently. It has a look and a feel and a scale unlike almost anything seen in a Star Trek project before, and I just love it. Kirk meets with Commodore Paris about an application he sent in for a position at Yorktown as a vice admiral. Paris tells Kirk, it's okay, you know, these things happen to starship captains sometimes. You spend too much time out there in space, and you lose all sense of direction. It's perfectly normal to develop performance anxiety. It happens to lots of guys. With all due respect, Commodore, where are you going with this? Wherever I goddamn like. Elsewhere on Yorktown, Spock, who is on a break from his relationship with Uhura, by the way, gets approached by some Vulcans. They have a private meeting under a bridge, like they're transacting some kind of interplanetary drug deal, and the Vulcans inform Spock that Ambassador Spock, or Spock Prime to you and me, the original version of Spock, played by Leonard Nimoy, has died. Spock is shaken by the news and tries to talk to Kirk about it, just as Kirk is trying to tell Spock about his plans to seek promotion and leave the Enterprise, but before either of them can really say anything, they find themselves heading back out into space on a rescue mission. This lady, Kalara, arrived at Yorktown aboard an escape pod and says her ship is stranded on a planet called Altamid, which is located inside a hazardous nearby nebula. When the Enterprise arrives at Altamid, Kalara's stranded spaceship story turns out to be a lie. To borrow a phrase from another sci-fi action-adventure franchise, it's a trap. The Enterprise is attacked by a swarm of small ships, all working in unison. Because the nebula has disrupted communications, they can't call for backup, and the Enterprise is helpless against the relentless assault. The leader of the attack, Krall, boards the Enterprise along with his soldiers and heads straight for the storage locker where Spock stashed that ancient weapon from the prologue. I guess it turns out to be important after all. Who could have guessed? Kirk has a confrontation with Krall in the corridor where he manages to take back the weapon and hide it somewhere, but that's the only victory he can claim. After the Enterprise is cut in half by Krall's swarm, Kirk is forced to order the crew to abandon ship. Kirk himself is the last one off, launching his escape pod as the Enterprise's saucer section falls to the surface of Ultimate. Most of the crew ends up captured by Krall's forces and taken to a prison camp, but Kirk, Chekhov, Scotty, Spock, and McCoy remain free, although initially scattered around. Kirk and Chekhov, along with Kalara, whose escape pod landed nearby, make their way back to the wreck of the Enterprise, hoping to use its sensors to locate the rest of the crew. Only that turns out to have been a ruse. Kalara claimed to have only lured the Enterprise into Krall's trap because Krall was holding her crew, but it turns out that was also a lie to try and earn Kirk's trust after the attack. When they make it back to the Enterprise, Kirk goes to get the weapon Krall was after from the hiding place where he stashed it, and once he gets it, Kalara reveals that she's been on Krall's side all along and sends a transmission to Krall's soldiers to come and get them. Only Kirk suspected that Kalara wasn't really on his side all along, so he was only pretending to go get the weapon in order to trick Kalara into turning on him and calling Krall so that Chekhov could trace the signal and find out where Krall's base is, and that's what happens. Kirk and Chekhov make a run for it, activating the Enterprise's thrusters along the way, which flips the saucer section over and crushes Kalara and Krall's soldiers, while Kirk and Chekhov are able to safely get away. Not long after that, they meet up with Scotty, who has made a new friend, Jayla, a young woman who escaped from Krall as a child and lives on her own in a crashed ship that turns out to be an old Starfleet vessel, the USS Franklin, which was reported missing about 100 years ago. Scotty gets the Franklin systems working well enough to locate Spock and McCoy, who crashed in a commandeered ship from Krall's swarm. Spock is seriously injured and confides to McCoy that he broke up with Uhura because he felt a duty to devote his life to helping rebuild Vulcan civilization following the destruction of their planet in the first Kelvin Timeline movie. Furthermore, following the death of Spock Prime, Spock has decided to leave Starfleet and move to New Vulcan. But no time to discuss that now. Scotty beams Spock and McCoy aboard the Franklin, and once Spock's injuries have been tended to, they start brainstorming how to rescue the rest of the crew from Krall. Chekhov thinks he knows where they are thanks to the signal he traced from Kalara, but they can't be sure. Luckily, Spock's got an idea. Uhura is wearing a pendant he gave her that's made from a mineral native to Vulcan. The mineral is mildly radioactive and should be traceable using the Franklin sensors. McCoy's like, hang on. Spock, you gave your girlfriend a radioactive tracking device as a gift? Yes, but not like that. It's from Vulcan. The place was a global desert with practically no atmosphere. Everything there was a little radioactive. And the tracking device bit? That's more difficult to defend in hindsight. But look, do you want to save the crew or not? Thanks to Uhura's creepy necklace, they're able to confirm the location of Krall's camp. But because of geological interference in the area, they can't just beam everybody out all at once. The only way to safely beam people from the camp to the Franklin is to get inside the camp and use signaling devices to give Scotty something to lock onto. Meanwhile, in the camp, Krall has managed to get his hands on the weapon. It turns out Kirk gave it to a crew member to conceal under the giant crab legs on the back of her head. Isn't Star Trek neat? Krall explains to Uhura that the weapon is called the Abronath, a biological weapon that destroys organic material on contact. Krall demonstrates it on Crableg's head, and it doesn't look very pleasant. He intends to lead his swarm to Starbase Yorktown and unleash it on the population. Also not very pleasant. While Kirk provides a distraction using a motorcycle that just so happened to be aboard the Franklin and some holographic projectors borrowed from Jayla, Spock, McCoy, and Jayla manage to get inside Krall's camp and liberate the rest of the Enterprise crew. Once everyone is out, Sulu gets the Franklin flying again by shoving it down a big hill and popping the clutch, and they take off after Krall, who is on his way to Yorktown with his swarm. The swarm arrives at Yorktown, and this dude, who's like the head of communications or something, sees it coming, and he's like, oh, that's just... See what happens when you spill your Coke and don't clean it up right away? Now we've got bees all over the place. The Franklin arrives on the scene, and after Spock and McCoy beam aboard one of these swarm ships and take control of it, the crew comes up with a plan that just might be outrageous enough to work. The swarm's ships communicate with each other over a short-range radio frequency. If the Franklin gets close enough, it can broadcast its own signal and disrupt the frequency, which would overload the swarm ships and cause them to explode. So, with Sabotage by the Beastie Boys blasting on the proper channel, the Franklin flies in close and destroys most of the swarm. A few swarm ships survive, including the one piloted by Krall, who crashes his ship into the Franklin on purpose, steals a uniform from one of the Enterprise crew aboard, and also alters his appearance using this trick he does where he grabs someone and kinda drains their life force. It's a whole thing with Krall. Once the Franklin enters Yorktown, Krall busts out and starts to make his way to the station's central ventilation system, where he intends to activate the Abranath. Kirk and the others figure all this out, and Uhura figures out something else, too. Krall's true identity is Captain Edison, the commander of the Franklin. They discover his old captain's logs in the Franklin's computer, which fill in some of the backstory. He's managed to stay alive all these years using that life force absorbing gimmick I just mentioned, which he found on Altamid after the Franklin crashed there. He was a soldier before the Federation was created, and the whole living in peace, finding strength in unity deal really didn't work for him, especially after his ship got lost and he felt like Starfleet and the Federation just abandoned him. Anyway, Kirk catches up to Krall in the ventilation system. They fight. Krall activates the Abranath, but it gets ejected into space, along with Krall himself, before it can hurt anyone. Krall ends up being consumed by the very weapon he intended to use to kill the population of Yorktown. That's why you really need to wear gloves when handling something like that. Later, after everything has settled down, with the Enterprise crew and the people of Yorktown safe, and the mystery of what happened to the Franklin now officially resolved, Kirk has another meeting with Commodore Paris. She's like, "So you still want that Admiral's job?" And Kirk says, actually, seeing the Enterprise torn to pieces and crash on a hostile planet, having to rescue my crew and save millions of lives from a ruthless space pirate with aspirations to become a mass murderer who turned out to be a bitter former Starfleet officer himself, it's all made me realize how much fun it is being a starship captain. So, instead of promoting me to Admiral, can you just build me a new Enterprise instead? And that's what happens! Everyone signs back on, including Spock, who changes his mind about leaving Starfleet after seeing a picture of Spock Prime with his version of the Enterprise crew and realizing how important his crewmates are to him. The new Enterprise, the Enterprise A, launches on its new mission, and the whole main cast takes turns reciting the Space, the Final Frontier narration from classic Trek. And that's the end of the movie. Not only is Star Trek Beyond a terrific sci-fi action-adventure film, it manages to avoid most of the traps other recent projects from Star Trek and similar franchises step in. First, it evokes the defining spirit of its franchise while still feeling modern and fresh. This was one of the central missions of the Kelvin Timeline series from the start, and it really comes across in the 2009 Star Trek film. Look, it's the characters you remember, only young and sexy. But Star Trek Beyond pulls it off more cleanly and effortlessly than either of its two predecessors. Like Star Trek Into Darkness, Star Trek Beyond opens with a scene that feels like it could have been in an episode of Star Trek the original series if that show had a bigger budget and been a bit more action-forward. Captain Kirk on an away mission, negotiating with some aggressive aliens, things go sideways and he has to get out in a hurry. It's silly, it's funny, Kirk rips his shirt. Star Trek. The main plot of the movie also feels very much like a modern interpretation of something that could have been a classic Trek plot. The Enterprise is called in for a rescue mission that turns out to not be a rescue mission at all, but a ruse by the bad guys so he can capture, or in this case destroy, the Enterprise and get something he wants. Krall comes across as an elevated villain of the week, and I mean that as a compliment in this case. Thematically, he's a good counterpart to Kirk, but he's not a lifelong arch nemesis. He's not trying to conquer the galaxy. The potential consequences of him achieving his goals are catastrophic, but the immediate goals that drive him in the story are simple and concrete. He wants to get this weapon. He wants to use it to attack this space station. The movie doesn't feel like it's trying to reinvent the wheel or do a "this ain't your father's Star Trek" thing. It's just trying to be a good meat and potatoes Star Trek story. And that's what it is. But, and this is crucial, in evoking and updating classic Star Trek, it doesn't make the mistake of rehashing an old episode. Star Trek Into Darkness tries this, and fortunately, though I still like Into Darkness more than a lot of Trekkies do, Star Trek Beyond goes in a different direction. The Kelvin timeline concept has potential for so much more than just retelling old Star Trek episodes, and I'm so glad that Beyond doesn't even flirt with that. It's not a reimagining of a TOS episode, its plot isn't a continuation or a revisiting of a previous story, it's its own thing. Certain creators of new Star Trek shows have this frustrating fixation with old plots, old characters, as though they view the purpose of their series to be reaching back to touch base with stories that were told 30 or 40 years ago. New Star Trek should be new stories moving forward. Star Trek Beyond demonstrates how even new Star Trek that is modeled on old Star Trek, with new versions of classic characters, doesn't need to waste its time jacking off over nostalgia. It can tell stories that add to the mythos of Star Trek, rather than just standing back and inviting the audience to admire what's already there. Second, the film, and the Kelvin series in general, has a great cast full of likable and charming actors, and the story gives all of them meaningful things to do and moments to shine. Kirk is clearly the lead. He has the most important character arc. He changes the most as a result of his conflict with Krall, but Spock also has his own arc, which parallels Kirk, as well as a story with Uhura that relates to his main arc and also helps to move the plot along at one point with the radioactive tracking device necklace bit. McCoy doesn't really have a story or an arc per se, but he gets paired up with Spock for a good stretch, and they're great together. Uhura not only gets her story with Spock, but also has the most significant personal interaction with Krall, and is the first to realize Krall's true identity. Scotty has a little side adventure with Jayla and gets to be the character to drive home one of the film's most important themes about the value of people unifying and working together. Sulu gets a family, gets to take command of the Enterprise for a bit, and is able, along with Uhura, to begin solving the mystery of who Krall is. Chekhov gets to be Kirk's sidekick for a stretch after they crash on Ultimate. Even Jayla, the new kid in town, gets an arc about accepting the help of Scotty and the others and overcoming her fear about returning to Krall's camp. Not everyone gets a lot, but everyone gets something. Everyone gets a moment or two to remind us who they are and what they bring to the ensemble. Nobody's just standing around with nothing to do because we expect them to be there. Third, fan service is kept to an absolute minimum, and what little there is gets presented with intelligence and restraint. If you watch my stuff regularly, you know this is a sore spot for me. I have very little patience for fan service and generally regard it as a blight that needs to be eliminated from the creative process entirely. But, as with pretty much everything else, a lot depends on execution. There is some fan service in Star Trek Beyond, but it never plays as gratuitous or pandering. It's tied into the story and characters in meaningful ways, and it's surrounded by fresh, new creative elements. There are lots of cheeky asides and winking references, Kirk tearing his shirt on the opening away mission, describing the Enterprise's 5-year mission as episodic in his captain's log, Chekhov sneaking in his everything was invented in Russia running gag from the original series. But the two most obvious instances of fan service in the movie are the USS Franklin and the scene where Spock looks at the cast photo from Star Trek V. Let me take those one at a time. The Franklin is a pretty clear callback to Star Trek Enterprise, which at the time was the most recent Star Trek TV series. This movie opened about a year before the debut of Star Trek Discovery. There are several reasons why the inclusion of the Franklin works for me. For one, even though it is a reference to Star Trek Enterprise, it's not a direct reference. It's not the Enterprise from that show. It's a different ship, supposedly from roughly the same era as that Enterprise. That gives the creators of this movie the space to make the reference, but also to make the Franklin their own. The set design, the uniforms, the general aesthetic of the Franklin is reminiscent of Star Trek Enterprise. It feels like it fits that pattern, but it's also different. It's its own thing. For another thing, the Franklin is eventually revealed to have an important connection to Krall. The villain of the film, Krall, it turns out, used to be Balthazar Edison, the captain of the Franklin. He and his ship come from a time before the Federation, before exploration and the pursuit of interplanetary friendship became the primary mission of Starfleet. Edison is a soldier who was unable to make the adjustment to peacetime. He needs conflict to give his existence meaning, and he has artificially prolonged his life and waited for the opportunity to bring that conflict back to the Federation's doorstep. The Franklin is not only a relic of who Krall used to be, it's also a symbol of what motivates him. The Federation ship he was given as a reward after the wars were over, that crashed and which he abandoned. That ship, which represents the dawning of the new era of the Federation, the era of peace and diplomacy which Krall so resented, is ultimately what enables Kirk and his crew to defeat Krall. Plus, everything we need to know about the Franklin, the era it comes from, and its connection to Krall is in this movie. You don't need to have seen a single episode of Star Trek Enterprise or even know it exists, and you'll get what the Franklin is and why it's important to this story. All of these things come together to ensure that the Franklin reads as a meaningful part of Star Trek Beyond, not an Easter egg. Next, let's talk about Spock and that Star Trek V cast photo that he finds in Spock Prime's personal effects. Initially, this seems like the kind of explicit fan service that I hate, but I'm about to blow your mind right now and tell you that I love this scene, and it's one of my favorite moments from the entire movie. Why? Because it's instrumental to Spock's character arc and to the film's most important theme. Spock has spent the entire movie questioning his place on the Enterprise, his place as Kirk's first officer, feeling like he should go do something else, feeling that, as he says to Dr. McCoy at one point, he owes a duty to his species to return to New Vulcan and assist in the effort to rebuild. He is deeply shaken by the news of Spock Prime's death. Before we get to the cast photo at the end, we get this shot of Spock holding a memorial plaque with an image of Spock Prime and his birth and death dates. That birth date is the same as Spock's own birth date. Remember, the events that caused the alternate reality of the Kelvin timeline to branch off from the Prime timeline didn't happen until after Spock was born, so that's literally Spock's birth date. And even though he presumably died of old age, because Spock Prime came to this era from over a century in the future, his death date makes it appear that he was Spock's age when he died. It's as if the Spock of the Kelvin timeline is looking at his own death announcement. It's a grim, sobering image. And if there's one quality Spock has plenty of already, it's sobriety. Spock's story in the movie is bookended by that memorial plaque at the beginning and the other image of Spock Prime with his Prime timeline shipmates at the end. And what is that image? It's a family portrait. A point that comes across through context even if you've never seen a Star Trek movie before. The fact that it's from late in the classic Trek movie era is important. This is Spock Prime at a point in his life when he's 20 or 30 years older than Kelvin timeline Spock. When this Spock looks at this picture and sees this version of himself at this point in his life, he's looking into his future. Or a possible future anyway, a future that he would be walking away from if he left Starfleet and moved to New Vulcan. He sees his other self, surrounded by comrades, by friends, by the people he serves with as a part of this crew right now. And he changes his mind about leaving. He decides to embrace the future and the family he sees in that picture. The bit with the Star Trek V cast photo works for a very simple reason. That photo isn't in the movie because the filmmakers wanted it to mean something to us, the Trekkies in the audience. That photo is in the movie because it means something to Spock. Finally, underlying everything else I've been talking about, Star Trek Beyond is fundamentally hopeful and forward-looking. It ends with our heroes regrouping and preparing to get back on the horse, the proverbial horse. The humongous metal proverbial horse being built in a time-lapse right out the window there. The movie is action-packed, but not gratuitously violent. There are some dark moments for our heroes, but it never wallows in grimness. The Enterprise is destroyed in brutal fashion, but the crew survives and triumphs, and a new Enterprise rises like a phoenix from the ashes. The story carries a message about the importance of unity and the power of cooperation, and repudiates the cynical notion that peacefulness equals weakness, or that character can only be built through violent struggle. That's what Krall believes. And look where he ends up. Floating in the void, being devoured by space termites. You want that? You don't want that. You want to be standing side by side with Captain Kirk, Spock, Uhura, McCoy, Scotty, Sulu, and Chekhov, eager to set off on the next adventure. So when I say Star Trek Beyond should be the blueprint for new Star Trek shows and films, these are some of the qualities I'm suggesting the creators of those new shows strive to include in their work. I'm not saying they should lift directly from Star Trek Beyond or just retell the same story or deliver the same message in the same way. I'm saying they should do what Star Trek Beyond does in their own way. Follow its example. Try to get right what it gets right. Try to avoid the common mistakes that it avoids. Make a Star Trek show with a story that is original and freestanding. Not a sequel, not a prequel, not something intended to fill in gaps in the continuity of past shows or engage in lore mending or any other circle jerk activity that's only of interest to the most pedantic, trivia-obsessed people in the audience. Use your new Star Trek show to take Star Trek somewhere new. Feature your cast. Give your actors room to develop their characters on screen, to show us who they are. Find a talented ensemble to tell your story, and give them all their moments to shine. Keep obvious fan service to an absolute minimum. And if you do indulge in a bit, do it in a way that means something to your characters in your story, so that it plays as more than just cheap, lazy nostalgia bait. And remember what makes Star Trek Star Trek. It's a sci-fi adventure show with important things to say. And one of the most important is, hey, if we ever get over our prejudice and bigotry and tribalism and actually work together, there is no challenge we can't overcome. I have my personal taste, of course. Ideally, I'd love for new Trek shows to feature no more legacy characters than those who have already been established in this current era, but even if legacy characters are featured, they can be used in a way that feels fresh and different from what we've seen before, rather than just repeating things we've seen in past Trek projects. Strange New Worlds, far and away my favorite of the current crop of Trek shows, is a great example of this. The cast is full of characters we know from Star Trek the original series, but the show doesn't feel like an Easter egg hunt or a gratuitous attempt to set the table for TOS. It feels like an entertaining Star Trek show that uses established elements in new ways. That's really the key to making good new Star Trek, I think. Whether you use legacy characters or not, there are always going to be some established elements just by virtue of the fact that it's a Star Trek show. Even if those established elements are just the most generic, basic, franchise-defining tropes, like the presence of things like transporters, phasers, Starfleet and the Federation, Vulcans and Klingons, stuff that every Star Trek show includes, or at least makes reference to. What really matters is what you do with those elements and where you go with them. The route you choose to take doesn't have to run through familiar territory, but even if it does, and even if we recognize some of the names and faces that we meet along the way, each journey should be unique and original and take us someplace we haven't gone before. That's what will keep Star Trek fresh, vibrant, relevant to its time, and timeless. My advice to anyone making new Star Trek is simple. When in doubt, do what Star Trek Beyond does. Just not literally, one Keenser is enough. Nothing against him. I got no problem with Keenser, but they even found something important for Keenser to do. He has a cold and he sneezes acid on the lock so Sulu and Uhura can sneak in and start to figure out what Krall is up to. God, what a great movie. Hey folks, hope you enjoyed this one. I'm going to let you know what the subject of the next Trek Actually video is going to be, but before I do that, I want to give shoutouts to some of my newest Patreon patrons and channel members. First, the new patrons. They are Brian Baer, thanks Brian. Ted Kai, thanks Ted. Elizabeth Gregory, thanks Elizabeth. The Unconventional Ghost Man, thanks Unconventional Ghost Man. Andreas, thanks Andreas. Mike Gates, thanks Mike. Glenn Hinckley, thanks Glenn. And now for the new channel members. They are Joe Gutierrez, thanks Joe. Keys Reeds, thanks Keys. Dawn Bailey, thanks Dawn. Zach Spoonamore, thanks Zach. Luke Amarzu, thanks Luke. Luck Dragon 2000, thanks Luck Dragon 2000. If you want to support this channel, you can do so by going to patreon.com/Steve Shives or clicking the join button to become a member of this channel. All patrons and members get access to exclusive posts that allow you to vote in the polls that determine upcoming Trek Actually topics, and also submit questions ahead of time for my twice-monthly Ask Away live streams. If you pledge $5 a month or more on Patreon or become a member at the $5 a month tier or higher, you get a shout out at the end of a Trek Actually video. If you'd rather give a one-time gift than a recurring monthly contribution, you're always more than welcome to do that by clicking the thanks button right below the video or via PayPal or Venmo. The links for those are in the video description. Many thanks. If you like what I do on YouTube, especially the Star Trek related stuff, you should also check out my side projects, The Ensign's Log, the Star Trek themed comedy podcast that I'm on alongside Jason Harding and Dana Cole, and Trek Reluctantly, the watch-along stream Dana and I do every Wednesday starting at 6 p.m. Eastern on this channel right here. As always, links in the description. Now, for next month's Regulation Trek Actually topic. In next month's video, we shall return to the world of Star Trek Voyager, not my favorite corner of the franchise, but a corner that contains some things of value, and even some things that perhaps are undervalued. I got started in this whole Star Trek YouTube thing when I made a video arguing that a widely disliked character was actually not so bad. And I'm doing it again, although my subject this time is so disliked that I decided to hedge my bets a little and phrase the title not as a declaration, but as a question. The subject of next month's Trek Actually video, as chosen by a majority of my Patreon patrons and channel members, is Neelix actually that bad? That's next month. I'll be back then and a bunch of times before then, so until the next time you see me, whenever that is, thanks for watching. And take care, everybody.